Welcome all of you tonight out in the audience. I also want to thank the nominating committee. We've been doing this for 3 nights in a row now, so we're not getting worn out, though, are we? We're very inspired by everyone we're seeing. A little bit about what the Met Council does, and I guess I'm going to go tonight with our buses, flushes, parks, and housing, and then tell you a little bit about Governor Walz and his vision for the Met Council and for equity and for One Minnesota. So from Governor Walz, this is something he recently said: we must ensure equity in everything we do, from addressing the unacceptable racial disparities in our state to ensuring opportunity is not determined by your zip code. So that's partially what we're looking for and what this is about. A couple other things. Governor Walz and Lieutenant Governor Flanagan want a Minnesota where every child has the opportunity to succeed and hope for the future. A Minnesota where the people whose lives are most impacted by public policy choices have a seat at the table, and that's particularly true at the Met Council. A Minnesota with fair wages, fully funded public schools, and affordable health care as a right, not a privilege. A Minnesota where we protect our environment, invest in renewable energy and jobs, and maintain our roads, bridges, and transit across the state. We want to bring this vision to the governor's office, and now we have done that with the Walz-Flanagan One Minnesota. So hope that sets the framework for tonight, and want to turn it over to our chair, Janet Williams, who is the mayor of Savage.
Well, welcome. And now we'll have introductions of the nominating committee. Ruby, you want to start? No, I'm sorry.
That's okay. Good evening, Ruby Lee, community member and ex-officio member for the council.
I'm Randy Maluchnik. I'm the chairman of the Carver County Board of Commissioners, and I represent Carver County.
Good evening, Lisa White, Washington County Commissioner, and I'm representing Washington County this evening.
I'm Pahua Hoffman, Executive Director for the Citizens League, and I'm one of the ex-officio members.
Good evening. My name is Andrea Jenkins. I'm the Vice President of the Minneapolis City Council, representing Hennepin County.
I'm Dave Bartholomew. I'm the mayor of Circle Pines, Minnesota, and I'm representing Anoka County.
Maurice Lawick, chair of the Met Council, and I'm ex officio.
Janet Williams, mayor of Savage, representing Scott County.
Welcome, George Torville, mayor in Inver Grove Heights, representing Dakota County.
Nikki Villavicencio, ex officio member. I'm from Maplewood.
Good evening. I'm John Choi. I serve as the Ramsey County Attorney, and I'm here representing Ramsey County.
Okay, so this, as we've talked about, this is our fourth of 4 regional meetings. We had our first ones 2 weeks ago. So after the meetings have concluded, we will be forwarding 3 names per district to Governor Walz for his review. These names will be made public after tonight. Governor Walz will make recommendations, will take these recommendations under review, and will make the selections for each district in late February or March. By statute, the appointments must be made by March 4th, 2019. Each one of the candidates will have 5 minutes to address the nominating committee. Expectation is that within these 5 minutes, you will address the 3 questions that you received ahead of time. The questions are: what policy issue before the council are you most interested in addressing and why? Please describe the amount of engagement and type of engagement you will commit as a council member. And 3, what have you done to advance equity in your district, community, and or organization that you have worked with? The timekeeper will give a 1-minute warning. And if there are follow-up questions from the nominating committee, the questions and answers must be concluded within 3 minutes. This will be strictly enforced to keep our schedule on time and to start the next interview. You must submit your signed background check form to be interviewed and considered for an appointment. So tonight, on District 2 applicants, our first one is Linnea Atlas Ingebretson.
District 6.
Oh, District 6, I'm sorry.
I was coming up anyways. Hello, committee and council chairs and committee members. My name's Linnea Atlas Ingebretson. It's a mouthful. I'm a resident of Golden Valley, District 6. I grew up and lived most of my adult life actually within 6 blocks of this building. So to be honest, it's a real honor to be in this space having this conversation tonight. I'm honored to be considered a finalist, and I'm humbled by the members of my community who are here tonight, my family, and the state who have recommended me for this position. It was quite a surprise to get requests to apply and support from so many different folks. I believe it's important to recognize the value of the Met Council's all of the areas of focus, because I believe that they are the intersectionality between them is key and important and something to lean into, from transportation, water management, economic development, housing, jobs. But in particular, to my heart, is the 2040 Regional Parks Policy Plan and park work and regional parks in general. I was the first chair of the Parks and Trail Legacy Advisory Fund Committee, and I've managed a nature center for Three Rivers Park District, the Richardson Nature Center in West Bloomington. I was the head of the education and outreach effort for the regional non-motorized transportation pilot program housed out of the Minneapolis Transportation Department. I'm a certified interpretive guide and outdoor adventure guide level 3. That's just a little extra something about why I care about those things. And for me, addressing equity as a park issue is so important for these reasons. First of all, it's a jobs issue. It's about conservation, sustainability, and that regional parks are a necessity in our lives and in our systems, in our communities. As a young person in North Minneapolis, being able to build a fluency in nature was possible for me here, living just a few blocks from Worth Park. And it's important to make sure that we're ensuring that that capacity continues for residents, not just in kids in North Minneapolis, but in all parts of our metropolitan area as we grow and change, and also as we get more and more disconnected to the nature around us. Privilege and dominance can threaten that aspect of regional parks. It has a growing and trickle down and trickle up impact on local park activities and state park activities and actions. If we don't bring everyone along and ensure that all people have a place in our park systems, that they're culturally responsive in what we provide and offer and inclusive, in the next 2 generations, I fear that we'll have a majority of people ready to vote and making decisions who we've prevented from having and developing a relationship with nature by telling them this isn't for you. You're not important in this space. You don't have a job here. You don't have a reason to come. Stay home and play on your Xbox, kind of thing. And that will impact our beautiful, internationally renowned resources in our community here. It's my experience and belief that we cannot be a whole people or whole communities without quality and convenient relationships in nature and park spaces. And it's for that reason that this is the policy plan that I'm particularly passionate about and have done a lot of work on with the Met Council and its committees relating to that and at the state level. I want to talk a little bit about my view on engagement and the importance. This has been a big part of my career and work in the last several years, in particular locally, since 2008. The events of 2016 really narrowed my focus and energy. I really wanted to be about making measurable differences, not show, not talk, but really measurable change in the spaces I had the ability to influence and advance equity. Frankly, I was no longer interested in the politics of things, which was something as a younger person I was really interested in learning about, the systems and the people and the different roles you can have and that kind of stuff. I just wanted to be about reimagining what could be. I needed that kind of hope and inspiration in my life. I think it's important when it comes to engagement for us to dismantle inequitable practices that have been baked into our institutions because our systems were built to support and hear certain voices and not others. First, a focus on what people need, not just what people who have influence and power have. So for those reasons, I think it's important to make sure that we are explicit and clear about our promises around engagement and participation, and make sure that we're following a plan that we own and are adhere to.
Okay. John?
There was something you said at the very beginning that really struck me, and I was very intrigued by it, but you didn't really expound on it. But
Sure.
I think I knew where you were headed, and I think you were onto something. But you talked passionately about parks, but you also linked it to jobs. Mm-hmm. Could you talk a little bit about that, please?
I'd love to do that. In my work on the Parks and Trail Legacy Advisory Fund, and one of the connections that was made, for example, is that in the 25-year plan, there's a commitment that we would spend money on non-capital investments. Connecting people to the outdoors is a key aspect of that plan, and when we looked and audited how we had spent funds, a very minute amount had been spent on actually connecting people to outdoors in the way that was articulated in that plan that was developed by people of this region, everyday citizens, and across the state. So we figured out the way to do that was to advise the Metropolitan Council to understand that we need to track that and make sure that we're stewards of that money by saying, let's make sure that connecting people to the outdoors was in non-capital investments. That's jobs. It can transition into what does $1 million or $2 million worth of mean to jobs in the regional park system here, or in a location in greater Minnesota. That's a lot of jobs for 25 years, each year. That's a small drop in the bucket, but that's one of those places where we look for that intersectionality between other aspects of what the Met Council's into, whether it's economic development and something like parks. Where can we maximize the places where those things come together? So that's one example.
Anyone else? Andrew?
Thank you, Linnea, for your presentation and comments. I'm wondering, how would you get the young people at Juxtaposition Arts engaged in the work of the Met Council?
Oh, well, I mean, I want to make sure I'm respectful of what they're interested in. I think it's important for the Met Council to be relevant. And so I'll give an example. When I was trying to get people engaged with very similar backgrounds and age groups to those who are at Juxtaposition Arts, they didn't want to have anything to do with what was happening. One, the meeting started at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It went on for like 3 hours. And to be honest, it was a lot of people talking about stuff over each other or just missing each other, and it was a lot of blabbing and stuff like that. And so what I did is I promised, these were slightly older, some of our young people at Jux are over 21, but I promised beer and pizza for anyone who would show up to the room. Because what I've learned is if the room looks different, people won't say certain things. And that was really important. So I think it's a both and. I think people want to be engaged, but young people aren't interested in wasting their time. And we have to make sure our systems and the way that we do our work are accessible, are meaningful, and that when I come and bring people with me and they're talking and testifying, we don't just shut the door and do what we want to do anyways. You can't have engagement is not a one-way street. It's a reciprocal relationship. And that's an important thing. So when I say we need to make an explicit promise about the level of participation we're going to have someone, the first thing would be to make sure we're having our promise correct and that it's accurate for what we're willing to deliver and that we're accountable to it. And then I think over time you build that relationship where then younger people will want to be engaged. But also I think shifting the meetings to more convenient locations and times and maybe thinking a little bit about, how enjoyable it is just a reality of the day. We got to change the way we do business, not just at the Met Council, but at the Capitol and city councils, and at our local organizations.
Can I quickly?
Okay. Thank you. Is that
Time's up.
right?
Sorry, I'm using someone else's phone.
Is that it? I really want to thank you for your time. Thank you for my family for coming. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Y'all ready now? Yeah. Okay, good.
Yeah, Katie's
Is it Janae?
Yana.
Yana. Okay. Must be Scandinavian.
It is. Thank you for the opportunity to highlight how my experience has prepared me to serve on the Metropolitan Council. I'm Jana Flissrand, and I've spent the last 22 years building equity, accessible, affordable homes, and practical transportation choices in the Twin Cities. They're critical to stability and opportunity for all, especially the people who have been historically refused a seat at the table. I've shared 26 support letters that show my relevant experience and that I will not take for granted my engagement with local leaders, institutions, or residents. I got my first lesson in land use planning when I arrived in the Twin Cities, renting a home in Crystal across the street from the airport. I was transit dependent with a nearly 2-hour one-way bus commute to my job running a drop-in after-school program in Frogtown. The kids at that program gave me my first lesson in housing policy. When a kid suddenly stopped coming, there was always a story about housing instability. A social worker declared their home overcrowded, a family pushed out by a rent hike or eviction, or because transit couldn't get mom to work. A few years later, I consulted to local officials along I-35W from Roseville up to Blaine. I helped them understand how boomers' housing needs were changing as they aged. And this is something that I've experienced in my own life. Last year, my 75-year-old mom had an age-related health problem that prevented her from driving. And I saw her struggle to navigate a similar community that wasn't designed for people who do not drive. Whether seniors can get out of their homes, whether kids can safely walk and bike to school, whether we have clean air to breathe and water to drink, whether we have enough homes so no one has to sleep outside or on their sister's couch, it's all determined by how we plan our region. While details look different in every community, land use planning is at the core of Met Council work, and it can open the door to opportunity or continue to shut certain people out. You'll see in my resume that my 2 decades of affordable housing work has included climate, energy, and utility policy, land use and public health, access to green space, and stormwater management. As a 22-year transit-dependent rider, I bring both my personal experiences and connections with my fellow transit riders. While I'm most passionate about planning that puts people first, I'm ready to contribute to whichever committees I'm assigned. One of the unique strengths that I bring is I know how the pieces of the Met Council's work fit together, and I have worked in some way on all of them. Shifting to my engagement approach, when I supported a public housing reform effort in Memphis, I did a project on the transit system. I started by asking public housing residents who relied on transit what worked well and what they wanted the transit agency to change. I framed the project around their responses and not my own transit user assumptions. That's how I approach engagement, by asking who's most affected and then listening to them. With 3 major transit investments planned in District 6, engagement includes working with elected leaders. 17 of them have given me their support because I have the passion and relationships to do that. Now, equity is about changing systems. I'm part of Streets MN in order to make the systems that plan our communities more accessible. As vice chair of the board, I built the relationships we needed to recruit more diverse writers and board members. I brought racially diverse, suburban, older and younger, neuroatypical, differently abled, LGBTQ, and renter perspectives to our team. I ensured meetings are accessible for anyone, including people with vision impairments. People of color face unacceptable disparities in this region, and we leave many kinds of people behind. I also prioritize redistributing resources and power. To offer one example, my privilege landed me a role creating a national network with access to substantial resources. There, I developed policies that ensured we recruited and hired people of color. I sought out and built personal relationships with Black and brown people working on related issues. I showed our grant review team the importance of funding community and BIPOC-led groups. Then, my job was to follow their guidance in all of our work. Shifting who sets the table is a core value that I have lived throughout my career and one that I will practice as part of the Met Council. I know there's a concern about appointing Met Council members who don't have the commitment the role takes. I share that concern because this role is critically important. 27 endorsements from leaders across the Twin Cities show that you don't need to worry. I'm one of those people who talks a good game about engaging the whole district, but doesn't have the time or skills to do the work. Thank you for your time, and I ask that you recommend me for appointment to the Met Council.
Any questions?
Sure. I look at your consulting, and you do a lot of great projects. A lot of them are on the same kind of issues that we've been talking about here and Met Council kind of areas. Does a person have to be worried that you have all this talent and you have all this experience, and how's that going to relate to the Met Council staff or your role there? Because now you'd be a council member, not necessarily a consultant and a content expert. So tell me how you make that all work.
Well, thank you for the question. I talked with John Commerce, who is also a consultant and does very similar work. I think that actually overlaps more with what the council does than what I do. My particular role tends to be about the engagement process and how do you bring all of the different partners together to collaborate to make progress rather than being the content expertise. So my role is historically about making sure we've got the right people at the table, that we're distributing resources to the right folks, again, getting back at that piece about distributing resources and power in those projects, and making sure that we're getting to the end. So my primary role is about making sure we're accomplishing the outcomes and focused on getting the results we need, not on analyzing transit data, for example.
Okay, thank you.
One question. I was just out of curiosity, if there was ever a situation where I think the community engagement perspective that you're bringing is really incredible and so important. But what if it conflicts with ultimately maybe your role to govern and to move something along because there's a federal deadline? When that comes into conflict, and maybe it's an important priority for Governor Walz in his administration and the things that he's promised to the people of Minnesota, how do you navigate that?
Thank you for that question. So I want to clarify that your question is about when the Met Council is doing engagement and there is a deadline. How do we navigate that? So one of the real challenges that we face when we're working on equity issues is that we're often deadline driven. And part of the challenge is that we have had hundreds of years of oppression, and we have focused on deadlines instead of focusing on how do we get to the right outcome. And so it is a challenge. Sometimes there are deadlines and they're pressing real deadlines, and I think that's a conversation where we need to work with staff, community, and to not short circuit the engagement because of an artificially created deadline if what we're aiming to do is to create equity in one Minnesota.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for your time.
Okay, our next applicant is Sean Pierce.
Good evening. Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee and community for coming out. I am Sean Pierce, as you know, and I am a resident of District 6. I am a regionalist, and I am a transplant here to the Twin Cities. I always think that it's important to first acknowledge that the work that we're doing today is done on stolen land and on the blood, sweat, and tears of Black, Indigenous, and immigrant communities. And the work of government, from my perspective, is to finally ensure that these communities receive the return on investment for the last 400, 500, 600 years of input that our communities, frankly, have sometimes intentionally been excluded from. So that's where my work is. It's the same over the 16 years that I've been in economic and community developments, whether I'm doing education, I've worked in the corporate sector, working at the Harrison Neighborhood Association, or even my time at the United Nations, or my time during national or international economic development work. I am intentionally intersectional because I know that when we try to say, oh, we're just going to talk about transportation over here, we're just going to talk about housing over here, we forget to have the conversation about what you do for the single mother in Crystal that's trying to get her to her second shift job over at the West End in St. Louis Park or at the airport. And we also forget that she probably has to drop off some kids, right? And maybe she has to face the fact that our metro mobility plans are actually underfunded. So although that always is a longer conversation, I like to be very, very intentional about first centering on the people who are most impacted. In my history, I have found that we have to honor the reality that we can't always tweak the current systems to make them work. And what I have loved about my interactions with the Met Council, I've served on the first and the second selection committee for the Equity Advisory Committee and a few other committees. What I've loved about that process is that the Met Council is here to guide our region in actually implementing equity and ensuring that people can obtain jobs and not just be employers but create wealth in their communities, and that's really where I am centered. My primary area of interest and focus is in our land use policy, particularly on mobility and transportation issues, primarily because that's where the money lands. I started my career out in public health and in housing work and in racial equity work, and I found that often when we talked about racial justice, it was over here, and I was a nonprofit doing the work, and we talked about housing, I was over here, and the really great affordable housing projects were nonprofit work. And when we started talking about investments and community engagements, and we started talking about community-led economic development, the dollars were actually following business. They were following infrastructure investments, and they were following the policymakers who were around for the longest period of time and knew how to wield the power. And that is a fundamental challenge to community engagement. It is a fundamental challenge. You don't overcome that with a newsletter. You don't overcome that by just saying to people, what do you want? In our region, we know exactly what people want. We have 40 years of studies of people saying, we want transportation to our front doors. We know that 47% of our suburban area is moving into the cities because that's how you get access to our workers. We know that when our cities can't figure out housing strategies, we displace people and we push them into the suburbs, and then we don't make sure that they can still make it to work. We know all of those things. We know that Black and Indigenous people of color, that particularly our Hmong and Lao community, that are people living with disability, our trans youth, our homeless youth, the homeless people who are riding our buses have been screaming for help for years. For years. So while I'm focused on where the dollars go, I could really serve on any committee. My priority is to make sure that the engagement and the policies align with the return on investment. So my engagement strategies would follow the necessary parties. The first would be quarterly meetings with our elected officials. I would actually create 2 street teams. The first street team would be really focused on riding on our buses and our light rails. The other would be engaging with community groups, not neighborhood associations. There's a distinction we can talk about later. The third is deploying some of the work that I started with Better Bus Stops and other things of that nature, and actually hosting community festivals in our districts and building on National Night Out, because we have to start meeting people in their front yards, in their front rooms, and not asking people to come to meetings like this or to City Hall and those sorts of things. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Any questions?
I have a question, Chair.
Yes.
Thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you.
Since you brought it up, I guess I'll ask you, what would you do if you become Met Council member to improve Metro mobility?
Oh, absolutely. There are a few things that we can do. One thing is that our state does not get reimbursement for a number of our healthcare programs, and that's at least about an $8 million budget item. So part of what we could do is build a relationship with our legislature to figure out the gaps that we have in funding coming in and start to appropriate that to the proper areas, particularly Metro mobility. The other piece, and I'll just be honest, I think this is where staff is an incredible asset. I find that our Met Council staff, our city's staff across the district are really, really knowledgeable, and sometimes they just haven't been unleashed. So I would ask them, what are the solutions that you've come forward with that perhaps were pushed aside because they seemed too hard, or it seemed like we weren't going to have the political will? I think with the current governor and the team all the way down, we have exactly what we need to solve the issue. It's several $1 million, but we could solve it together. And our business community pays a lot of our transit, so they're ready to lean in.
Nora?
So the budget's coming out on Tuesday,
Yes.
so just stay tuned. and
I'm watching.
Everybody's support on that.
Absolutely.
And I'm kind of intrigued with your transportation to the front door, right?
Yes.
Because we're not quite doing that right now. So how do we do that? What are some ideas on that?
Well, Madam Chair, Chair Slawick, thank you for the question. There are a few things that we can do. The first thing is we have to stop this suburban, rural, urban divide, right? We have to deal with the fact that the people who live in our cities are going to our suburbs and out to our rural areas, and actually a lot of our jobs are scattered around. That's important because again, I said our transit system is currently funded by our private sector largely. And if we can build a coalition where our community is in leadership and our businesses can come along the side of those folks to fund their ideas, we can properly map the routes. Right now, we're trying to have a conversation about where we theoretically think things will go, where our studies say things can go. And I can tell you from negotiating foreign direct investment in our community, from negotiating as a Harrison Neighborhood Association with the very area that we're in right now, people have the solutions. We actually have to invest in the folks who have already come up with the strategies but have been told, your idea is too big and we can't do it right now.
Thank you. Anyone else? Andrea?
Really quick.
Yes.
Homeless people riding the trains at night. What
Yes.
would you do?
Thank you, Madam Chair, Council Vice President. Great to see you. There are a few things that we I think should do. The first thing, and I know St. Paul has been working on this and a few others, we have to spend some time with them, really mapping out those folks who are ready to transition into some sort of transitional housing and those sorts of resources. But the other piece of it is that our homeless system is overburdened. Can I finish that? Is overburdened. So I would host a listening session. I would figure out a partnership with some of our more creative developers and community leaders and figure out if there's a cyclical way that we can figure out how to house those folks. And I'll just say that seems kind of, like willy-nilly, but we actually did it for Super Bowl. We housed every person for Super Bowl. And if we can house everyone for Super Bowl, and we're planning on doing it again for our other events, then we can figure out a way to get our neighbors, many of whom are going to work every day, many of whom might have chemical dependency issues, many of whom are actually veterans, a lot of whom are youth, into the proper programs because we have them in our region.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Paula Pentel?
Thank you, Madam Chair and committee members. I'm honored to have a chance to be here before you this evening seeking to represent District 6. As a community organizer, an educator, an urban geographer, a former elected official, and a lifelong resident of the Twin Cities, I've come into close contact with almost every policy and system area of the Council and look forward to sharing my views with you tonight. Currently, I sit on the Housing Committee of the Project for Pride in Living, and in my day job, I coordinate the undergraduate urban studies program at the University of Minnesota, hiring local practitioners to teach at a rate showing diversity much greater than our university has in their faculty. I teach 5 classes myself, and I've been advising undergraduate majors since 1994, and they've infiltrated every level of government, many of whom have gone on to careers at the Metropolitan Council. I grew up just a mile north of here. I graduated from North High, as many others have in this room, and just a mile in the other direction, and I live across Theodore-Wirth Park in Golden Valley. As I said in my application materials, I know firsthand how important stable housing is in creating stability in families, and I applaud the Council for their work on housing issues, and I know through PPL that none of our projects would get built without having some investment in using many of the Livable Communities programs for funding. The question I wish to address first is advancing equity. I feel that to understand the need for equity, folks need to understand the role of privilege and inequity. My students use the term woke. The Urban Dictionary defines woke as being alert to injustice, especially racism. Here in Minnesota, we think that we're this great north and that we're all full of promise, but the reality is that our region has great disparities. Although I've been teaching the geography of the Twin Cities for over a decade, it's only in the past couple of years, by incorporating the work of the Mapping Prejudice Project, that I've been able to have students see for themselves, by cataloging actual discriminatory language and deeds, how homeownership and subsequent wealth accumulation was unequal and stacked against people of color and other ethnic minorities. I discuss and engage students around issues of equity and social justice in every course I teach. One former student recently posted on Facebook, that feeling when you're in law school reading about racism and policy and legislation, and all those urban studies classes hit like a wave. And other students chimed in about that, former students. I'm proud of the students' lives I've touched and the support I can give them as they move through the University of Minnesota and as they move through their careers and work in areas that they're passionate about. I've just stepped off the board of the West Broadway Business and Area Coalition. I served as a volunteer on that board for about a decade. The West Broadway Coalition is a strong network of for-profit and nonprofit businesses and residences supporting one another and seeking creative solutions and promoting a welcoming, wealth-generating West Broadway. We had some, I oversaw the Planning, Zoning, and Development Committee while I was on the board, and that gave people a chance to see developments that were proposed to come to West Broadway prior to them making it to the City of Minneapolis' Planning Commission, and having folks feel like they had a say in development and how development was going to occur on their neighborhood and in their neighborhood. In my work, I try to create ways forward and find consensus wherever possible. And in terms of engagement, I've learned the importance of meeting people where they are. Being transparent about what the processes are that they're going to be involved with, what the next steps are, and finding ways for folks to have genuine input. That means building relationships, having respect, and listening. I think the West Broadway Coalition, because of its ability to be a kind of a straightforward player, has helped in building the consensus among a lot of the organizations on the north side that are working together on so many great projects. I have the capacity and the time and capacity to attend evening meetings and daytime meetings and weekend meetings. The policy area I'd like to work on, in 2000 I developed a class called Understanding the Urban Environment. Through this course, I've become passionate about water issues, and where others hear discussions of wastewater plants and start to nap, I become excited, and I seek out tours of wastewater plants when I vacation. I don't know why people don't want to go on vacation with me, but threats to growth in the region, and this includes the communities I would represent, are impacted by issues in our wastewater treatment system. We want to preserve system capacity and not be allowing the inflow and infiltration of clear water. When I sat on the Golden Valley City Council, we were one of the first communities to put forth very kind of strident and strict and point-of-sale guidelines trying to impact that inflow and infiltration. I'm becoming a master water steward and supported by Hennepin County in that effort. And I believe the council, Met Council, can play even a larger role. I'm glad they're beginning to look at surface water and drinking water resources as well. Water is too valuable to be used only once.
Questions?
Were you completely finished?
Yes, I can.
Oh, okay. That's always the easiest question.
Yeah, that's an easy question, but anyone else has a question? Okay, Andrea.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Pintel, can you talk a little bit about your ideas around engagement?
Yes, I think that one of my former students, I actually went to the engagement plan for the Met Council, and there's a video, Soweto Abdi, on there, and she speaks very eloquently about how engagement, you need to be able to listen to people and have them feel as if you're not just writing down what they have said, but you are actively listening. And all of you have been incredibly great active listeners. So often at meetings, you have folks sitting behind a table, and then the public has to approach, and sort of ask permission. I'd much prefer, and when it comes to transit planning, instead of putting dots and Post-it notes on a map, I want there to be a blank map. I'd like people to be able to, let's get people involved at the beginning. And I know we have a lot of technical expertise, but I think quite often we bring folks into the planning process and engagement process a little bit late. So I'm comfortable meeting with citizens, I'm comfortable meeting with staff, with cities, elected officials. Yeah.
Okay, Dave.
Yeah, I have a question about how, with your experience at the university and your other work, how you would best suggest communications with areas of the metropolitan area that maybe don't quite embrace metropolitan governance or planning, that might be viewing things a little differently. You talked about engagement, you talked about listening. Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts on that?
Well, you guys don't have much of a Twitter presence, but perhaps I'm not following the right accounts. I think that figuring out how people are getting their information, right? Are there community newspapers? Most communities have an environmental commission, or depending upon what the topic is. You figure out within that community, is there a task force or is there a commission where you can make that first inquiry and that first sort of get yourselves in front of that organization. and it can be helpful. And having people who are passionate about what they do, I think it helps a lot.
Okay.
Good.
Yes,
Hi,
thank
how
you.
doing? Metro Council, they take a look, and I know that you talked a little bit about wastewater and reuse and whatever, and it's an interesting topic, and they're starting to get involved in it. But not everybody, probably maybe in the committee or the metro area, says, well, that's not such a good idea. Let's move on. I'm interested in housing. I'd like to know maybe some of your around education pieces or whatever. What do you do even on a council that so it's split, and how are we going to come to a final decision and whatever? Some of your
We all want to be able to flush our toilets. We do. And water resources, we are lucky in Minnesota. We think we are the land of plenty, but in reality, much of our groundwater is now polluted. Much of our surface water is polluted. And this active reuse, I think, of effluent, and there's one of the wastewater treatment plants where they're going to potentially move that effluent, that wastewater that's been treated, off for another use in a cooling tower is brilliant. You know, figuring out ways to percolate water back into the soil and replenish these aquifers that we have taken for granted for decades is necessary.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, and our last applicant for District 6 is Thomas Streitz.
Good evening, Madam Chair, committee members. It's fun to be here and listen to all these great ideas. I've enjoyed everyone. Really, truly, from the bottom of my heart, it's terrific. So thank you for this opportunity. My name's Tom Streitz, and I want to thank you for the opportunity to appear for you today to advance consideration of my nomination to be Metropolitan Council Member for District 6. I have a 30-year history as a civil rights lawyer working in our community in a variety of capacities in government, the private sector, and nonprofit leadership. The common thread that ties together the various roles I have performed in my career is my passion for and focus on advancing equity by addressing long-entrenched racial and economic disparities in our community. My areas of focus on the council would align with my expertise in housing, land use development, and transportation connected to jobs. And I want to make a really fine point of this. First and foremost, I want to focus on what I believe is one of the greatest challenges our region faces currently, and that is a growing labor shortage and a disconnect between workers and jobs. Twin Cities Rise, the organization I currently lead, is training the workforce of the future and simultaneously providing critical, well-trained workers to businesses throughout the metro area desperately seeking work. Transportation remains one of the greatest impediments to addressing the mismatch between where many workers live and job locations. One of our employer partners is a manufacturing business in Burnsville, highly successful, called Quality Ingredients Corporation. They now employ over 20% of their manufacturing workforce through Twin Cities Rise graduates. We're talking about African American men and women from the north side who are working in Burnsville. And guess what? QIC is paying Uber and Lyft to take them there for the second and third shifts because we just simply can't get them, and they would be giving the job up. So we're paying half the Uber and Lyft costs to get folks from this neighborhood out to Burnsville for jobs that pay $25 an hour with benefits. And that's what I see every day on Plymouth Avenue and Bryant Avenue where our office is. This is a fundamental issue facing Minnesota and our metropolitan community. I testified in the Senate today on this very issue. In terms of my housing experience, I played a seminal role in the Holman v. Cisneros lawsuit and consent decree that provided for reducing concentrations of poverty, expanding affordable housing opportunities for low-income people throughout the metro area. The Met Council played a critical role in the lawsuit that I brought in helping us provide housing, affordable housing for people in suburban communities that previously never had it. If you drive out 394 and go to Minnetonka, those are the first affordable housing developments built in years because of the role the Met Council played with us at Legal Aid through the lawsuit we brought. I'm an expert in Section 8 housing. I've worked with the Met Council in Section 8, public housing, affordable housing, and real estate development. Gained as my role as a legal aid lawyer, deputy executive director of Minneapolis Public Housing Authority, and the housing director for the city of Minneapolis for 8 years. In addition, I'm the founder and current board chair of the Twin Cities Community Land Bank. I created the land bank at the height of the foreclosure crisis to acquire real estate in challenged communities at low prices to protect low-income neighborhoods and residents from predatory speculators. I'm proud to say that we purchased through the land bank, starting in 2009, thousands of homes out of foreclosure, redeveloped them for low-income and middle-income residents, and created thousands of new homeowners. In 10 years, we've had 2 foreclosures out of thousands of new homeowners created in this community and communities throughout the metro area. In addition, the land bank acquired all over the metro area housing and property for affordable housing developers and made low-cost loans available to developers to build more affordable units in transit-friendly locations. We've done that throughout St. Paul. We've done it in Edina. We're doing it today. The land bank has been a real force for acquiring property, making sure it's available for affordable housing development. Very proud of the creation of that organization. It speaks a lot to how I think. I'm a problem solver. I've got 1 minute. I'm going to solve this problem. As I mentioned earlier, job training and transportation for low-income workers is a critical area of focus in my current job as president and CEO of TCR. For over 25 years, Twin Cities Rise has been focused on training and attaining meaningful employment for low-income individuals with the most challenges to employment. And as I mentioned earlier, this transportation piece is key. Finally, I want to share with you something that I think is very important, and that's my firm belief that solutions to our local challenges and opportunities require bipartisan support. This can't just be a Democratic enterprise or a Republican enterprise, or we're going to be stuck where we've been stuck for years in this community, having the same fights. I have spent 25 years lobbying at the federal level and at the state level, very successfully working to build coalitions across urban-rural divides, across urban-suburban divides, with people on the Republican side of the aisle and people on the Democratic side of the aisle. Until we engage and get to that kind of discussion, we won't move the ball forward in a meaningful way, and that's something I can do and do every day. Thank you.
I have a question. How would you engage the everyday constituent?
Yeah, I love that because I have 22-year-old twin sons. And I'll tell you why I mention that. Because I think social media is a source of sometimes evil in the world, right? We see it every day. Yeah, I don't have a Twitter account, so that's the good news if anybody's worried about that. But I will say that social media can be used much more creatively for people who can't get out of their home, who have disabilities, for younger people who want to engage. They'll watch a broadcast, maybe on something on Facebook. They'll engage through social media, but I don't think we're adequately reaching out to them and using those resources, right? So that, to me, is a critical piece. Let's get young people involved in public policy. I love that. Whoever said that, I agree 1,000%. And make it relevant to them so they think that, right now, if you ask a 22-year-old what the Met Council is, they would just look at you like, whatever, right? The reality is we have to be relevant to them and to people where they're at. And how you do that, it isn't just like showing up at a Met Council meeting and having a hearing. It's living in the community, it's being active in the community, and people find you and say, what are your ideas around solutions to transportation, right? That's what I get excited about because we have solutions in our community right in front of us that we just haven't taken the time to really advance and have the kind of conversations, honestly, that we need to have. And once again, I would just emphasize, we need to do it on a bipartisan basis, right? It has to be something where we find commonality and we bring people in before we divide people up. And I think we spend way too much time thinking about how we're different than how we're the same. And I have found in my 30 years as a lawyer, civil rights lawyer, if you focus on what makes us the same, and then we have the same problems, we have children, we have disabilities, we have challenges, you focus on those commonalities and you get to solutions.
Okay, George. Tom, how you doing? I'm sold.
Nice to see you.
Here's my question to you.
Yes, sir.
With all the lobbying, the good things on the land bank and everything else, I may take you off the street for 4 years from the activities you're doing now because somebody might raise their hand and say, oh, yeah, that's great for Tom to think that, but we don't agree, and he can't be lobbying on that and then voting on issues that may be diverse or whatever. I just kind of a interesting piece to it.
Yeah, here's what I'd say, George, is that
that's what I wanted.
Is that I focus on solutions. Everyone knows that about me. Ask anybody at the legislature, anybody I've worked with for the last 30 years. I'm known as a person who leads with passion and caring, and I find commonality and get things done. I don't spend a lot of time on focusing on the differences between what we do, and I think I create solutions that way because I work with Republicans, Democrats, young, old, black, brown, white, and the solutions like the land bank are right in front of us. We just have to be creative. And engagement is so key, and I think using social media, thank you for that question, going out and living it every day, talking to people who come into Twin Cities Rise and tell me they can't get to a job and they're going to lose their job because they don't have a car anymore, it's heartbreaking. And that's the focus, George, I want to bring. Thank you. Am I done?
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Great to see everybody.
Thank you.
Okay, that's the end of our District 6 applicants' interviews. So we'll take a little break